Let me do the formal welcome. Welcome back to the virtual workshop on new tools for coordination and leadership of virtual work, sponsored by the Sociotechnical Systems Roundtable, STS Roundtable. I'm Pam Posey, and I'm here with Betsy Merck and Doug Ostrom and Bert Painter. Betsy and I are going to be guiding you through today's session, although I'm sure Bert and Doug may jump in at some point to offer their ideas too. We should remind you that if you haven't had a chance yet to visit the Roundtable's website, we recommend you do that. There are lots of articles, there are webinar recordings and other models and helpful tools that you might use in your own work. Betsy, can we go to the next slide? Thanks. This is simply a reminder. We're really happy to have you all use any of our work and share it with others. Be really great if you could tell us what you're using it for and how you built on it so that we can all learn. We do ask that you give appropriate attribution to both this team and the National Science Foundation, who sponsored the base research that went into this work. And so I think, you know, we'd love to know how you use this. I want to remind you, you've all done this beautifully, but we'd ask you to mute your microphones unless you're speaking. And then we'll remind you, as I need to be reminded, that I'm on mute if we need to do that. So let's talk a little bit about today's work. It's session 2 in a 4-session series, and we're trying to share with you some diagnostic tools and design options to help better coordinate and lead the virtual work we're all engaged in these days. We're trying to use an interactive process to explore the challenges we're all facing. And, you know, in the era of Zoom, that means we use chat and we use sort of the breakout groups to get everyone involved. We want to hear what your thinking is too. Last week, we talked about the challenges that we all face in working virtually. And we spent some time working to understand the degree of uncertainty that is inherent to our work now and the implications for how we can better design that work. This week, today, we're going to talk about how to design solutions to address some of the challenges that come up for us. And by session 3 and 4, we're going to be working on the specifics of how to coordinate, how to lead, and then we'll bring it all home by putting it all together. So today, our objectives really are to dive deeper into what's different about virtual work and what we have to pay attention to in order to design it more effectively. And we'll also begin to look toward the end of the session today at some of the things that get in the way. What are some of those barriers that cause problems as we're trying to work effectively in this virtual environment? The agenda, just so you have a sense of where we're going, we've done a welcome. I think we've somewhat done some chatting. We'll do a little more. We've done a bit of an overview, and we'll spend a few minutes here catching up. We've got a question for you on chat in a minute, and then we're going to move right into the work for the day. Key concept that we're working on today is about deliberation design, the key conversations that we call deliberations, and how do you design them so that they're most effective. So we'll do that. We'll move into a breakout room activity. And once we've done that, we'll begin to talk about barriers. We'll carry that on into next week. And then we've got homework for you if you're so inclined. So I think with that, we ought to move into this. Let's do another Who's Here Today activity. If you'll turn on your chat function, what we'd like you to do is just once again, quickly tell us what the work is that you're doing. And today we want you to think about to what extent was virtual work part of your reality prior to COVID-19? I mean, how much of your work was virtual then versus now? What part of it was virtual? If you can just enter those in chat, we'll pick up on that. You know, I was thinking about this question, and I think prior to COVID-19, which for me, February 1st, prior to that, I probably spent 20% of my time in virtual work, directly working with clients. And today I spend 100% of it. So that's a big shift. And we just want to get to thinking about that. Now I've got to find my chat function while you all type in. Okay, I'm beginning to see some responses here. Mark was saying that a very small part of his work was virtual. You can all read these comments too. Jesper says 95% is virtual today. So I'm wondering if these are changes. David says virtual work was only a small part earlier, 15%, but he's had experience with 100% virtual work environment in the past. I think that probably helps some of us who have had some of that experience. Major shift. So Pete says consulting was 30% virtual, now it's 100%. And as Pete on the board was 75% virtual, now it's 100%. So I think, Betsy, that our topic here today is fairly timely in thinking about how to coordinate, how to lead the work that we're all engaged in 100% of the time, right?
Right.
We can keep entering in the chat. Betsy, I think what we ought to do though is review a couple of the key concepts from last time,
right?
From the last session, and then move on from there. Do you want to take over for a bit?
Sure. Thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world. It's always really fun to see you. And in some ways, for me, this is kind of like, I'm going to say almost a first lecture. It's not meant to be a lecture, but walking you through. So I'm challenging myself while we're challenging you all to kind of pick up new theory and practice. So we wanted to review just very quickly, because I think almost everyone on the call right now was with us in session 1, but we weren't certain that was going to be true. And for many of you, not all of you, but for many of you, we were introducing in session 1 2 new tools, the continuum and the notion of deliberations. So this is just a very quick couple of minutes, refresh into that. And then we're going to go back into chat and let you ask questions about these 2 tools. And we'll try to answer them. And maybe all 4 of us will get involved. All 4 of the designers might get involved in answering the questions depending. And then we're going to try to move more deeply into the design elements of deliberation. Okay, and we're going to spend some time looking at that. And then we're going to move forward and move into other things towards the end of the 90 minutes. But first, just to take us back to the continuum. So if you recall, in manufacturing, we knew what we were doing and pretty much how we were going to do it. In non-routine work, the whole focus is on uncertainty. And where we are in the continuum really helps us understand the level of uncertainty. So this was very quickly from Bell Labs. They used this to understand in their portfolio of research where they were from R to D to A was what they would have said. But the first thing that we were suggesting last time and that we're still suggesting is the value of this continuum is to understand the work that you're engaged in. How clear are you about that work? So if you look down at the far left with the highest degree of uncertainty, you really don't know what you are looking for and you don't know how. So very fundamental research. Down to the far right, you've worked your way through this, although it's not necessarily a progressive stage. If you're a developmental or a researcher, fundamental researcher, your tasks may shift, what you're looking at may shift, but you're pretty much always up in exploratory. You're never going to move down into, just about releasing it into production. But if you're in the applied, if you are, let's say, let's use COVID for an example. If you're a COVID researcher, you're fundamentally up. You can imagine all sorts of scientists all over the world right now sitting up kind of what we would say in the U6 category. What do we know about this virus? And what don't we know about this virus, right? So trying to understand what are the elements that what do we know? What don't we know that we need to know? And how would we go about finding that out? So a great deal of uncertainty. Where if you move down to the U1 to the far right, let's say that's all hopefully in very quick order, because we're all waiting for this.
Yep.
Let's hope that a vaccine is developed. And if you're down in the far right, you're probably about, we know what we're going to do and we know how we're going to do it in terms of now manufacturing that vaccine, right? Or distributing it even into the world. So then it becomes much more repetitive. You know what and you know how. So the value of placing your work on this continuum is to help you start to anticipate what are the questions, what are the vagueness of the questions that we need to pose, ask, and answer, and what kind of coordinating mechanisms, how are we going to manage finding these answers out, which really differs across the continuum. So that was the first tool that we introduced. And the second tool that we introduced is the notion of conversations. Key conversations or key topics that we need to increase the clarity on, increase the certainty on, so we can move. I'm watching Pete, I'm watching you eating and you're making me hungry. That we can move forward on. So key conversations are sequences of exchange. They're patterns of communication among parties that need to be involved, and we're going to get to this in a moment, to reduce the unpredictability or to reduce the ambiguity. So if you go back here to this and thinking, what do we know and what don't we know about the elements of the coronavirus? A key conversation may be just that, trying to figure out what do we need to reduce the ambiguity on in order to move the work forward, in order to start to do some research. We're not necessarily, so okay, let's stop there. The thing that we wanted to call out to you between last week and this week in the chat box, and I think Pete, you were part of this, and I think Bill, what is Bill's last name? Not Passmore, but well, it doesn't really matter. Kaibach, something like that, was asking questions about, are these problematic issues? And you guys surfaced, well, maybe problematic isn't the right word. Problematic is the word Kalpava used, but it's not necessarily to frame it with a definition or an adjective around the word problematic. What they are issues that need greater clarity, however you want to frame that up. Problematic, opportunities, it doesn't really matter. What's essential to understand are these are issues or topics that the group, the right people, which we'll talk about in a moment, need to engage in conversations, looking at data to reduce the unpredictability or the ambiguity so there's enough clarity to move forward. So with that, what we'd like you to do, and I'll type this in to go back to chat, is give you an opportunity to ask questions about these two models. So we're going to give you about 3 or 4 minutes to type into chat, and then we're going to come back, and we're doing fine on time. We're going to come back and try to answer your questions, and then we're going to move forward into a greater depth. around the notion of deliberations.
So just to reiterate, the question is, what insights or questions do you have from session 1 about using the uncertainty continuum and identifying the key conversations or deliberations?
Maybe there aren't any.
Do you want us to speak them or put them in chat?
Well,
In
we thought of it in chat, but there's so few of us. Put whatever you have in chat, and then we may maybe talk about it as a group, Pete.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And just to clarify, we'd like to know what insights you have in response to what we did last week, or what questions you might still have about the continuum of work uncertainty or the definition of deliberations.
So maybe we can pick up while people are still writing in, and I can try to answer some of the questions.
Sure.
So let's go back. I think there's some questions about the continuum. And some of the questions are, one, is there something to read about it? And yes, there is in the website. We wrote in the fundamental research paper that we wrote on the research that is foundational to what we're sharing with you today, so you can understand a lot more. But in terms of placing, and I see someone saying, well, maybe I wouldn't use the continuum until I was face-to-face. But I could imagine that you could use the continuum with your clients virtually, like sharing it with them and helping them plot where they might be on the continuum so that they can understand what are the questions that they continue to have as they want to move forward. Like, do they know what they're up to, for instance? If you look at U2, do they know what they're trying, what's their objective? What are they trying to do? Do they know what? Is there agreement about that? And do they know how they're going to achieve it conceptually? They may not have tried it, but there's an agreement about this is what we think we're going to do, and this is how we think we're going to do it. So the continuum, one of the questions from Larissa, I think last time that we looked at in chat, was how do we know where we are on the continuum? What questions, or do you have a tool to this design team that helps us understand the continuum? And as we thought about it, the continuum itself is the tool to help you plot the questions or to identify where you are. By that I mean asking the group that needs to understand this, do we know what? So just across this, don't know what, or do we know what? Do we know what we're after? That's a conversation. That's a key deliberation. Do we have enough clarity that we're clear, this is what we're trying to achieve? For instance, we're trying to achieve a vaccine that possibly can be used around the world. Well, what would that mean, right? Can't be refrigerated, can only be one dose if you're paying attention like we all are to the news. Do we know how to achieve that conceptually? Those questions with the right participants help you identify, actually, we don't know what, so this is what we need to figure out. We don't know how, so this is what we need to figure out. So that's part of it.
Could I jump in real quick?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so Jean asked a question about the continuum, whether this issue of uncertainty exists for both face-to-face and virtual work. And of course, I think for sure the answer is yes. The difference might be that in virtual work, the implications of the continuum are slightly different in the sense that it is a clue as to what degree of bandwidth you need in your coordination mechanisms to handle the different levels of uncertainty and information processing. And with virtual work, a lot of those coordination mechanisms that we use in traditional collated work are disrupted. So it becomes even more challenging. And that's why it becomes more critical to understand clearly the level of uncertainty you're dealing with. And I think that another question that Hugh asked about whether you would actually explicitly discuss this issue with the group, I think where it becomes most critical is when you start to shift from, say, a more applied to a more developmental type of work, because it'll affect what kind of coordination and what kind of deliberations you're going to have. So you can't apply the same practices to different types of work. Those are just two quick comments to some of the observations in the chat box.
Great. So let me say, if anybody else, and then we're going to move forward just to keep our time. But Pete, if you have a question, you want to unmute yourself, or if anyone has a question, we could maybe have one more question. If anybody wants to ask anything, Pete?
You know, I mentioned in the chat that the one large client that I'm working with, they've said that the more routine tasks, such as processing purchase orders and doing research on, you know, these kind of purchase order supply chain related issues, they're getting them done well remotely. There is a nuance there that's challenging, however, because as they're working on supply chain issues, they're and working on with their suppliers, they're having to do a different kind of inquiry with the suppliers to find out whether COVID is having an impact on the supplier's ability to design and produce the parts that are needed. And they're struggling with that, and I see that as less routine and more ambiguous process. And so the more concrete, I've got a purchase order, I know how to use SAP, I know how to fill out the forms, I know how to do the processing, is going better. The more ambiguous part of, you know, really trying to probe into what's going on in the client or the supplier system is difficult. Another example here is that
that's one example, and I'm going to move forward. But it's a great example, if I can stop you, to take you into this, right, Pam? This is where we are now.
Yes.
To designing deliberations. So going, you just introduced another factor in terms of the world has changed, the context changed, right? Now COVID has interrupted something that we routinely had down before. And suddenly we kind of have to go back up into that continuum. A greater degree of uncertainty just emerged. And I want to use your example, if I may. So that is designing a deliberation, and your clients are very clever if they're the same people that you brought into USC, the city folks. They understand that the participants now need to shift in terms of who is involved in the conversation so we can increase the certainty. So what we wanted to talk about specifically today was, how do you design these deliberations? Once you're on the continuum and you've kind of identified where you are in terms of level of uncertainty, to great uncertainty, to less, as Pete said, understanding exactly how to place orders. They're way down into the U1, very clear level of certainty, but something interrupted it. So that's a topic that becomes ambiguous, and you need to have a conversation in order to increase the clarity around that topic. So that's designing a deliberation. So here we're saying, so the topic's identified. So how do you design a deliberation? Some of the questions last time, I think, Raul, it might have been you, and Larissa, it might have been you. How do you get the right people to be involved? So you're identifying in a deliberation, there are 3 key things that you want to pay attention to. And again, deliberation you might think that that's kind of a jargony word. Again, that was a word, that was Cal Pava's word. But the more that at least I have thought about it, it's not a casual conversation. It is deliberate. It is deliberate to reduce the uncertainty, to increase the clarity. And I suspect, although I don't know, that's why he called it deliberation. And that, again, is the word that we want to use going forward to, So in deliberations, they are deliberate, and lots of these conversations happen. But using your example, Pete, maybe the city people might not have gotten their suppliers involved. Without thinking about it consciously, they might have made some assumptions and just tried to move forward. And in all of our consulting experience and organizational experience, okay, that didn't work. And then you go back, right? We realized we needed other inputs. So who are the right people? You want to think about who are the right people that need to be involved in this particular deliberation? Who are the critical stakeholders? Who has the information going into the conversation that they can bring in, experience, ability to reflect and think, and who needs that information also going out of that conversation? So who are the right people? It's the first element. What's the data? Some of it is actual data, depending on where you are in the continuum. What do we know about how we place these contracts? What do we know about the reliability of these suppliers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? There might be real data, data analysis, analytics, algorithms, but there's also tacit knowledge, right? That sitting in people's experience. So do those people need to, are they the participants that bring in that data? So thinking what is going to be helpful to us, so we don't like cancel this conversation. Okay, this didn't work either. Let's go back. We realize we need something more. And then what form they should occur in. Are these structured? It's like, it's 10 o'clock. We're going to do it on Zoom. We're going to now, right? Think about it used to be face-to-face or maybe a phone call. But now it's going to be all intermediated with digital technology. And the question then is what technology, how we're going to do it, how structured. Is this just a conversation between me and Pete, or is this a conversation where we need to get the city folks involved and some of the supply chain people involved? We need to think it through, and then how are we going to do it? I don't know if Eric Nicholson's on our call with us today, but I think our little design team, we were curious. Eric and most of you were on the call last week. So if you remember, Eric was talking about the labor negotiations with, I think, the farmers about the health of the farm workers as essential workers, right? How do we keep them healthy? And Eric shared with us that that was a phone conversation. And what we were curious about, how was the decision made, thinking about the forum? How was the decision made about whether it was a phone conversation or a Zoom or a Skype where we could actually get the benefit of the nonverbals? So I don't have the answer. I don't know if Eric's with us today. If you are, Eric, unmute yourself, because we would really love to hear.
He's not with us today.
He's not.
Anyhow.
Okay. So our point here was realizing, and deliberations, again, aren't necessarily decision-making. An outcome could be a decision, but they're not necessarily decision-making conversations. And it's also important to realize that in deliberations, lots of time what you're trying to do is make sense of what is known, or even make sense of what is not known, and how do we move it forward. It's clarity that we're after many, many times, sense-making and increasing clarity. It's not always that you're going to force an agreement. In fact, probably never are you going to try to force agreement. You're trying to listen to the different perspectives, understand the different values of the stakeholders that have been invited to this deliberation, and can we find enough common ground to move forward, right? And the more that you are engaging with some of these people over time, you start to build trust. And to go back to Eric, Eric would be maybe the first person that would claim working with the farmers and trying to not organize them. He's UFW. He came from a labor organization, not to necessarily organize those farmers, but to create better working conditions for the farm workers. That took an enormous amount of trust building to get to the point that he could have a conversation about how we're going to keep people well and healthy. So understanding that lots of it is understanding perspective and finding enough common ground. Sometimes these conversations happen over and over again as you increase perspective. And the last thing I wanted to say about participants, Cal used the word, and certainly Doug and Carolyn, some of our colleagues, have written papers about deliberations, and they use the phrase discretionary coalitions. Again, that sounds kind of jargony. Again, that was Cal Pava's terminology. But the more you think about it, they are discretionary. Who you choose to invite is in fact discretionary, right? Yep. And I think all of us have been involved in situations where I had a client with Carolyn actually last year that had a huge deliberation around, 2-day long conversation around how much they were willing to shift their business model based on the input of their customers. And who they didn't want to have in the room was the sales force. The sales force are the people that have all the day-to-day conversation with the customers. They weren't up for that. So they really limited, there wasn't enough trust. So politics get involved in these discretionary coalitions. Culture gets involved in discretionary coalitions. But really thinking about the term and breaking it down a little bit, unpacking it, to realize there is enormous discretion involved in how you identify the participants. And they might not all be from the same organization, and they might come together around different issues. That's the kind of word coalition. So with that, I think, Pam, am I right? We're going to go into a breakout activity.
Yeah. Let's see if we can practice some of what we've been talking about, get a little bit of work done on it.
So here, I think Doug is going to put us into breakout groups. There's so few of us on this call, actually. Maybe there'll be 3 or 4 breakout groups.
There'll be 4.
4, okay. We sent you this slide ahead, so hopefully you have a copy of this. And I will put this into chat if I can, but I'm not sure you can see chat while you're in a breakout group. But what we're asking you to do is think about a key deliberation, as Bert just identified. One that you are having or think you may have or have had. And we want you to think about now, how was it designed in terms of the elements of the design that we know you really need to pay attention to be conscious of. Who are the participants that are needed? What's the information that's needed? And what's the best forum? And now thinking of it digitally intermediated, what's the best forum to use for the best outcome? So we're going to give you about 25 minutes. I think maybe it's 20 minutes, Pam?
Yeah, about 25.
Okay, 25, and then we'll come back and I'll call on group by group. So please select someone that can speak out for your group. Okay, Doug?
I'll get them to their rooms.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Doug Benedict has arrived, eh?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's the 4 of us.
Doug, can you mute? Can you stop the recording?
I did.
Pause it? Thank you.
So another point to offer, and why this is in many ways a more radical departure than what people realize, is that we often start with the team and think about what topics or issues they should be deliberating, when in fact the nature of the work, especially being nonlinear, and how this fits into much more dynamic designing, is that as these new challenges emerge, you don't start with what team do we give this to, as much as who are the voices that we need to have in the room, whatever the
Right.
room might be. And that is really a hard concept, a number of levels. One, because self-managed work teams was the kind of like the go-to strategy of traditional STS, and also because people tend to approach these things based on their existing teams, which, so, we start talking about being more agile, we start talking, and I don't mean agile development, but just that kind of adaptive capacity. It
Doug, you're totally right, and I forgot to say it. So maybe when we come back, let's have report outs, but put your voice in, put that in,
Sure.
because that's a really good point.
Yeah.
I was trying to raise that with discretionary coalitions, but I didn't do it as clearly as you did.
Well, the
Well, I thought you did a good
coalition.
job.
Sorry, Pam. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I thought you did a good job with discretionary coalitions. It was
Yeah.
called Betsy.
Oh, great.
So what came to mind, Betsy, well, further to Doug's comment, you could take Pete's case around purchase order processing. And what that piece of work could generate is a need for a deliberation about what are the standards we're going to apply to the timelines for response to purchase orders. What kind of standards are we going to apply? And that deliberation may be provoked according to different situations that arise when you change your product. And as you're saying about participants, I mean, you've got to think about who do you need to involve in that discussion about the standard development for timelines. Quite aside from shippers, do you need to involve your product sourcers? Do you need to involve
Right.
your warehouses?
Right.
Do you need
Right.
to involve your customers?
But Bert, you come back in and say that. I mean, that's great. So I agree.
And now Mark had a question. I mean, I've been watching the chat, and I
Yeah.
was just
It's
wondering-
impossible to watch the chat while I'm lecturing or talking.
Right, I know, yeah. So Mark asked the question, what's the difference between a deliberation and a meeting? And I think that's a very useful discussion point. I'm sure you can handle that one, Doug, but that might be one to
Yeah.
respond to. Because
Right.
a deliberation goes on well beyond what we normally call a meeting.
Right.
It-
Well,
But
the
the
meeting would be the forum, right?
Yeah,
That's right.
it's all about
The-
advancing knowledge.
Yeah, but that's an important distinction to make in the same way you've made a distinction about the fact that a deliberation is not just a decision. It's the actual pattern of communication and ongoing exchange.
Well, but it's
So-
also, Bert, you're leaving out, it's a pattern of reflective behavior and
Yeah,
communication. And reflective behavior is both individual and combined.
right.
I
So anyway,
think
maybe
that
that's
was
those things to respond to when you come back.
Yeah.
So listen, guys, when we come back, it'll be about 11 o'clock. We can take maybe 10 minutes to kind of process.
Right.
And then we're going to have to move into the activity around barriers and close out for the day.
That's okay. Right. But
Um,
if even, so when I bring them back, it's like group one, let's listen to their questions, but I would love it. It just takes a little pressure off me. Doug, if you or Bert, you put in your observations, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll
here's
defer to
the-
Doug on this one because
I'll call you out to do it. Doug, do you want to
Okay.
add? I'll just say we were talking during this and here's a few other points that we want to share. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. But let's
Okay.
listen to them first. Good?
Yeah, here's the thing. I'll just give you a name of, somebody dropped out. So,
We knew Steve Alter.
yeah, Steve Alter, he had to go.
okay, in breakout room 1, you have Jesper, Yagada, and Hugh. You can just pick one of the names.
Right. Okay.
Just say, hey, Hugh, who in your group was gonna
Right.
share? The next one, breakout room 2, is Mark or Rahul.
Mark and Raul.
Yeah. Breakout room 3, Colleen, David, or Jean.
David who?
David Friedman.
Okay.
Oh, we had somebody else leave too. So Peter and Benedict are in room 4.
Just the two of them?
Yeah. Wilt Alexander was here for a while and then left.
Okay. Okay. Okay, thank you for that. So here they come back.
Here they come.
Okay, okay. Okay, I can see that you have come out of your breakout rooms and back to the group as a whole. And what we'd like to do now is ask each group, and I know the members of each group, so I'll just call on one of you by name. And what we're interested in hearing and sharing is your insights or questions you have about that activity. We just asked you to take, each of you to take a deliberation. Maybe you chose to share one of them among yourselves, I'm not sure. But what did you find when you were trying to think about designing a deliberation? What questions or observations do you have? So with group 1, I'm going to ask Jagada. Do you want to report out? Just a minute or two, no more than that? Any questions, insights, observations? Did that group come back? Is Jagada on with us any longer?
I don't, it doesn't seem like she's come back. but I
Jagada,
was-
you're
I'm
muted.
here. I'm here.
okay.
I'm here.
Okay,
Here I am.
okay, great, Jagada. Did you hear my question?
I did not.
Okay, what we're interested in knowing from each breakout group, and I'm asking you to represent group 1, nice to see you, by the way, is what insights, observations, questions, as you guys went into this group activity and worked your way through it, do you have for the larger group? We're going to hear from each breakout group, and then we're going to try to come back in for a few minutes and answer questions, any last comments that we have, and then we're going to move forward.
Okay, I think Hugh, who was also in my group, and Jesper was in my group, Hugh took more of the notes. I'll just say that we started out by talking about just some of the different kinds of issues that we have in our respective work. And as a part of that conversation, without going into those details, as a part of that conversation, we recognize that trying to do our work in a virtual environment due to COVID was creating uncertainty, not so much about the what we were trying to do or what the types of deliberations were that we wanted to establish, whether that was in an educational or training environment or in a leadership facilitation environment, but that the how to use the virtual environment in a way that continues to make human connections, build trust, allow for some of that, spontaneity and informality that you get when you're face to face that sometimes gets lost. How to use the tools like maybe Miro or Mural or others that, so there's good technologies available, but how to make use of those in a way that really helps build trust. It's that human connection piece. And so that's the uncertainty that we're trying to address.
Great, thank you. And that in and of itself, right, that is the how, that is a deliberation in and of itself. So maybe amongst you in the group, Hugh and Jesper and yourself, Jagada, that's an example actually of a deliberation, right? Exactly. Thank you. I would ask you to add to this, but we don't have very much time, Hugh. So I'm going to pass. If we have more time, I might come back.
Okay.
So in group 2, it was Mark and Raul, and maybe I should just say which one of you is prepared to share out between Mark and Raul.
Raul asked me gently and politely to do it, so
Hey, Mark, hi.
I'm forced into it. I'm so, but he's going to help me. Well, we had all kind of angles that we looked at the matter, but one of the topics that came forward for us was that if you are going more to the left side of the figure, you know, you go to U6 and U5, you're more in a context that you have to that you are, let's say, exploring and trying to figure out, you know, what's going on.
Right.
And in that context, it can be, it is, in our opinion, very crucial that also things that may get lost because of this technical layer, that you lose all kind of yeah, human elements, like somebody is surprised or, you know, is doing other stuff. But now you see just this two-dimensional part, you know, you only see the box and you don't see any other important issues which can contribute to finding your way out of the unknown, because in the U6 and U5 you're in basically in an unknown context. That's one thing. So you could say there is a sort of dehumanization of maybe a loss of richness of the social interaction, which is needed in this kind of work to find maybe answers. So that's one thing. Another thing that was brought forward is the issue of rules. So if you want to have a decent conversation via a digital platform, it might also be that people that already had difficulties, let's say in the face-to-face context, just to contribute, but they were contributing maybe not much in quantity, but in quality, that they might get lost and don't feel, you know, that they're not engaged. So that means the role of the moderator or the chair might become different than in a face-to-face context. So maybe there is a set of rules that needs to be in place so that everybody can participate, whatever. But for us, the most important thing was that let's say the richness, which is to a large extent is gets lost, is taking out because of this technical layer, might actually have a negative impact on the outcome, what we're trying to achieve with U5 and U6. Is that a little bit correct, Raoul, what we were discussing, or did I forget something?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, absolutely.
But what
Thank
we
you.
found in our research was even in the U6, U5, in the higher degree of uncertainty, face-to-face kind of rubbing shoulders became really important.
That's what I mean. Yeah, that's what you mean.
Exactly. So you and Yagata, your groups were kind of having similar things. So the conversation, and I guess we're all going to have to figure this out, right? With two-dimensional, what do we do with the loss of the kind of the social touch, high touch, even the non-verbals, right, are really difficult. But let me move. Thank you, Mark and Raoul and Yagata. I don't think I thanked you. Let me move to group 3. So between Colleen and David and Jean Fuller, which of you would like to prepare or report out, excuse me?
I think I have been volunteered by my group.
I know you. Nice to meet you, David.
Nice to meet you. So in terms of what we, insights we had or questions that we had, I think one really good insight is that there's often a confusion between decision-making as the goal of a meeting or of a deliberation, as opposed to pushing the ball forward. So when one says, what do we need to move the work forward? A lot of people mean, well, we need a decision, we need which path to go down. But actually, we might just need one large mess to be split into 3 smaller messes, or we might just need input from people so that someone else can go off and make a decision. So that dovetailed with the example we were working on, which was my example, which is how I got volunteered here, where the deliberation was structured as a sequence of events, not as one event.
Right.
And the sequence, even within the sequence, multiple tools were combined, just sort of like you would do if you were designing a workshop for people that was going to take 2 days. You wouldn't put them all in one room and say, talk. And just because that's the default mode for Zoom doesn't mean you have to do things that way either. Right. And we, in fact, you can combine different tools, like do brainstorming, have very few people report out, and then have a Google Sheet available for people to post everything that they didn't get to say in the public setting and know what's going to happen with that. So it's not necessarily everybody has to be in one room. It's not all, multiple tools can be combined. And in the example we were talking about, I had a great advantage, which I didn't realize till we were in the bigger group, which is that the people knew each other, right? We're in a phase of remote work where we all, the group of 30 who were involved in this process were pulled from a group of 80 who all know each other.
Right.
So it's easier when it's not strangers.
Right.
But a lot of work is not with strangers.
Right. Right. But a
So we
lot
can
of work
take
will be
advantage.
coming back to the notion
And,
of discretionary coalitions. So,
and some will be with strangers and it can't be helped. And then
Right.
you need to do different things.
right. Okay, thank you very much. Those are great insights. And the last group was Peter and Benedict. Who among the two of you is prepared to report out?
I'm going to go ahead and share this time. So
Okay.
we designed a new term, and it's agile. Let's see. Let me get back to it because I put it in chat.
I see it.
Do you? Agile improvisation is where we started with, and then we got to iteration. So we were looking at a fairly complex problem that hadn't been dealt with before, and so the forum actually had to be designed,
Right.
the forum was like David I think said, a sequence of events.
Mhm.
The deliberation occurred in this forum over a period of time, a number of different events, and the deliberation had different participants in different ones of these events. And so you're designing the deliberation, you're designing the forum, and you're trying to go through that process of, do we have all the information? Okay, how do we decide? How do we plan? How do we act? And the more you get into the uncertain end of the spectrum, the more complex the designing of that agile improvisation iteration thing has to get, and it's less forward. In the example that we talked about too, there were high emotions and high consequences that
Right.
involved monetary stuff as well as emotional stuff. So it was, you had to figure out how to keep it from devolving into an argument.
Okay.
Try to
Okay.
keep it rational, so to speak.
Okay. So some good facilitation is necessary. So I think that's all the groups. And there's just one point maybe, or 2 points that we wanted to make before I turn it back to Pam to look at the next step. So thank you all, first of all, for engaging in your breakouts and having a conversation and asking and raising interesting insights and good questions. And unfortunately, due to time, we never have enough time, right, to answer all of these questions. But a couple of things that we were observing, to go back, and even thinking if I can continue to use your supply chain issue and ordering issue with the city, thinking about who would be the notion of discretionary coalition. And remember, discretion, who needs to be in the conversation, right, in the deliberation. It could be, and Doug wanted to surface this, is we default typically, because we've been thinking about it typically, we often default to the team. Who's the team that's been issuing these orders, or the procurement team, for instance. But now, and this is where digital tools really help, it's not necessarily the team itself that owns or should be the participants in the deliberation, right? Let's go back to COVID for a second, or even let me just stay with your conversation. It might be people in the supply chain, it might be procurement people, it could be finance people, it could be all sorts of different people other than just the team that's responsible for this, to really get their hands around this issue, to increase the certainty around whatever you're trying to deal with, and then move it forward. So that's one thing. Don't think of it always, it's a team. The other thing that we were trying, I think I'm going to, hopefully, this is kind of a complex topic in a way, that when you think of non-routine work and to contrast that to routine work. So having done work in Hewlett-Packard in the early 80s, thinking about a printed circuit board going into a computer, There was a printed circuit facility. That was one unit of work. Those boards would come forward into the factory. Then there was a line that would solder this piece to that board, and then a line that soldered a camera to this, and then a line that soldered the microphone, for instance. Those were pieces of work. Everyone knew that was very routine and how to move it forward. There would be problems, but they knew what the problems were against that work. In non-routine work, the conversations are that, or the deliberations are the conversion process. They're what allows the printed circuit board to move forward and be soldered and add a piece. What you're doing in deliberations is the work. It's the conversion from what's the information that comes in, having a deliberation, and as many of you in your report outs just talked about, they can be repetitive deliberations. Different people, let's talk about it and let's hear it again. Let's get different perspectives in so that we can increase our understanding, make sense of what we're talking about, and increase knowledge. And so that is the conversion process. And the output is an ability, enough certainty that we know how to move forward.
Yep.
With that, Pam, I'm going to turn it back to you. You can maybe put a period on that, Pam, if you want to, add anything, and then we'll move forward. Just okay.
I think the only thing I would add is something that Bert and Doug were talking about while folks were in their groups, and that is that really much of the work that we're doing now, much of what we're doing is processing deliberations, whether they're sequential or not. I was intrigued with the comments. Thank you all for sharing. And I noticed there were some sidebars in chat that we'll take a look at. I want to move us ahead fairly quickly. And I want us to begin to think not just about deliberations, not just about how you design them effectively, but what gets in the way? What are some of the barriers that get in the way of us having effective deliberations that impact the work positively? And in just a minute, I'm going to ask you to start Betsy, can you go to the next slide? Yeah. In just a minute, I'm going to ask you to use chat to begin to talk about what some of the barriers you've encountered or anticipated that are related to key deliberations in your work. And you may want to use the deliberations you talked about in the breakout groups. You may want to use something else. But just generally think about what the barriers are. Let me give you a quick example. I work with a school district here in Washington in which all of the administrators, 200 or so of them, were scattered around the district in different buildings. And one of the major things that they worked on was designing and building a new administrative center where all administrators could come together in one space. People were scattered over 6 or 8 locations. Departmental silos were some of the tallest silos I've ever seen. And so we used the building design, the architect was great, and we created basically an open space administrative center. Glass walls, doors that couldn't lock, no shades, so that you could see everybody who was there and everything that was going on. And over the first 2 years or so, the culture changed dramatically. If a problem came up, you could see who was available and pull in anyone who was around to get them working on the problem. There was tremendous access to all administrators in the building, including the superintendent, and the collaboration level skyrocketed. COVID-19 comes in, Governor Inslee shuts down schools in Washington, shuts down everything, and people are now working from home on Zoom or Microsoft or whatever platform they're using. And guess what? We no longer have access. We no longer know who's around. Collaboration is more difficult because without the visual cues of seeing who's there, you don't put the right people in the room. That's a barrier. As much as this technology is wonderful, you know, I wouldn't see any of you without it, but it gets in the way. It has become a barrier to collaboration in that school district. What kinds of barriers are you running into in your deliberations, in the work? Can you take just a minute and type that into chat? Have we already got a lot of them? Yeah. Let's see. Students refusing to use a webcam. Good, Mark. Yep. That's a real barrier. Lack of technical skills. What else are we seeing? High emotion, cost, politics. The political issues are huge ones and can become barriers to the effectiveness of deliberations. Ill-prepared meetings, yeah, if you don't design those effectively to get where you need to go. Okay, there doesn't seem to be any shortage of barriers that we're able to come up with. A bias from senior leadership toward decision versus deliberative process. That's a good one, yeah. So are you following this chat? This is, we're seeing a lot about what these barriers are.
You can also see, Pam, let me, you know, also a barrier, I think, is just the current context.
Yes, yep.
You know, the desire for senior leaders to make decisions versus deliberating, people are under so much pressure, right? That,
yeah.
No, let's not spend any time because they're afraid of what's coming at them next.
Yep.
So context can be its own barrier.
Absolutely. And Mark mentions multitasking, doing multiple things at the same time. Boy, that does get in the way. It's not only distracting, but you really can lose your space. And David, I like the notion, we heard some of this last week, but you're talking about there's too much information sharing and for this kind of medium that we get tired, right? We get tired. Anyway, so there are lots of barriers that get in the way of helping us. Now, the reason I wanted you to think about this today is that next session, we're really going to talk to you about what we've learned about how to mitigate those barriers, how to develop solutions. We have discovered that there are a number of barriers that you can, let me use the word categorize, although I don't want to say they fall neatly into different buckets. But we have discovered a typology, I guess, of the kinds of barriers that get in the way. And we have some ways to think about how to mitigate those. And we're going to jump into that when we start again next time. Betsy, do you want to say anything more about barriers before we kind of move into a wrap up and some questions?
Well, I think, you know, we're all sitting here thinking, okay, we looked at the continuum. We're starting to get past that. We understand, or we're starting to understand what is a deliberation, why is it important, and how we might think about designing it. But still in all, you know, what else is out there to help us coordinate and lead virtual work? So understanding there are all sorts of things that do get in the way, as Pam and you all are just, we know that, but then what do we do about that? And that's what we're going to talk about next.
Yeah, it's the what are we going to do about that? And in a non-virtual world, we'd all be sitting around a large table and we could jump right in. We have to delay that until next week, unfortunately. But we are going to talk about the categories of barriers, most of which we frame as knowledge barriers, and we'll explain that next time. And we're going to talk about how to resolve the challenges that come up with those barriers, okay? I think that we have some homework for folks, don't we, Betsy?
Yeah. So if you choose designing this as a workshop versus a webinar, trying to keep you all engaged and make this much more interesting, I hope for all of us, is take what you learned today and think about this and practice this. Again, if you choose. in your work, maybe you will have an opportunity to identify a deliberation and can think about the design tools that we introduced today. It should be in there, the participants, the data, the forums to have a really good, effective deliberation. And then as Pam is just laying out, in preparation for what we're going to talk about next time, thinking about key barriers that your clients are experiencing that get in the way of successful deliberations. I think many of the groups in your report outs really talked about one that I don't know what kind of human beings we're going to turn into, but clearly a key barrier is the loss of social interaction, high touch, the nonverbals, rubbing shoulders. The technology is wonderful, but no matter what, we're at a huge remove from each other. What do we do about that? Clearly, that's a key barrier. I don't know if any of us yet have the technology. I mean, someday maybe we'll be in virtual rooms and we'll feel like we are right next to each other. Maybe there'll be technology that drives that. I don't know. But so in preparation, and then let me say, do that if you want to do that, because that's where we're going to begin. And then I'll remind you also some of you said, is there more we can read? And let me just take you back to the website. Irina, who's a steward, as is Pete. Pete's the head of the stewards for the Socio-Technical Systems Roundtable. There are enormous papers and resources that Irina organized for us around this particular workshop. So I think they're relatively easy to find. And then from session to session, just to remind you, we will have a recording, and I will copy the chat, and we'll put the chat in the website as well.
Yep.
Okay. So thank you very much. We're actually done. Maybe we have time for a few questions, Pam, if we want to.
What I was hoping.
Okay. Let's do that before we kind of bring this to a close.
Yes.
Are there any questions that we think we could answer in the time we have, about 4 or 5 minutes? Anybody want to raise a question?
There was one question that came up, I think may have been from Mark, was how is a deliberation different from a meeting?
Right.
And the nature of deliberation, if you think about it, is what are all of the different activities? And David and others in their debriefs did a great job of recognizing that there are any number of ways of advancing knowledge. And sometimes it's not just advancing knowledge with other people. It can be an individual interacting with a new article or something they see on a website, or I don't know, a eureka experience. But it's both reflective and communicative patterns of interchange that lead to expanding what we know about the issue that we are dealing with. And I think there was a great segue around, the active iteration, agile. And I think, Pete, you're segueing perfectly for next week, because we're going to talk about the coordinating mechanisms that seem to fit best with the levels of uncertainty that the deliberation entails. So,
anybody else comment? Mark, do you have anything you want to add?
No, it's fine. No, I mean, we'll catch up next week.
Okay.
Yes.
Peter, do you? You look like
I put the address in the chat for the articles section on the resources page for the STS Roundtable, and particularly I recommend for this webinar virtual workshop the VOS section, the virtual organization section that's was based on the research that this team has done. So, and just the only other thing I'd say is the Emperor of the Roundtable is much gratitude to everybody on the team that's put this together, and for everybody that's participating. I'm really grateful to all of you. You're doing great work.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Pete. I believe Irina actually sent out a specific link to the 3 to 4 articles that we had identified for folks to read. So
you'll find it. It's there.
Yes.
Okay.
Hey,
bye.
thanks.
Thank you very much. We'll see you next week, next time, same time, next week.
Okay.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
good.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.